Deep in the suffocating green of the Louisiana bayou, where the trees lean too close and the water mirrors more than just the sky, lies a place untouched by time and feared by those who know better than to wander. Locals speak of an old shack hidden in the swamp where an 80-year-old man lives alone, off the grid, speaking to no one but the wind and the shadows. They call him Big John Duvall. Most think he's just a crazy war vet, a relic of another era left behind like rusted metal, but they don't know the truth. They don't know what kind of soldier he once was, how he trained killers in the jungles of Vietnam, how he learned to read silence the way other men read maps, and how he became something more than a man, something stitched into the land itself. When a ruthless criminal militia dares to cut through his sacred terrain, believing it just another forgotten stretch of swamp, they think they're dealing with a lone old man. But the bayou has rules, and it has eyes. Creatures move beneath the water, loyal to no one, and John is not alone. There's something else out here, something he once raised, something wild, ancient, and bound to him by blood, by history, and by a promise that never truly died. As the invaders vanish one by one, fear spreads like fire in their ranks. Because in this place there are no accidents, no coincidences, only consequences. This is a story of memory and survival, of beasts and men, of debts long buried that never stopped collecting interest. Welcome to the place where time rots and legends don't sleep. Welcome to the bayou where even the dead know not to tread. The bayou didn't sleep. It breathed, low and humid, exhaling fog through its cypress teeth, hiding secrets in the rustling reeds. Sergeant John Duvall, called Big John back when he still had muscle over bone, sat on the warped porch of his shack, a jug of moonshine swaying like a cradle in his cracked hand. 80 years wore on his frame like moss on an old tree, but there was a stillness to him, a waiting kind of calm. He watched the water move, not with the eyes of a man but with those of a predator. Out here he wasn't a relic. He was the land itself, gnarled, forgotten, but rooted deep. Word had it he was crazy, that the jungle took pieces of his mind and left ghosts in their place. But the locals didn't know about the things he buried beneath the bayou or what he'd once raised among its slithering life. The night cracked with cicada song and the distant howl of something too large to be a dog. John didn't flinch. Instead, he reached down, brushing his fingers across an old leather belt hung with spent bullet casings, keepsakes from men who'd once tried to come through here. They never made it out, and neither would the men coming now. Earlier that day, a boat with twin motors and too clean paint had skimmed into the swamp's edge, guided by a tattooed man with a broken nose and no patience. Behind him were crates, ammo, rifles, black market gear. Not locals, militia. One had asked in a sneer if old McBayou still lived out there, holed up with his ghosts and moonshine. The guide only nodded, but his face paled. John had seen the boat. He'd felt the tremor in the reeds. This was no simple smuggling run. These men were soldiers, the wrong kind, arrogant, brutal, dangerous, because they had no respect for the land. And John knew that kind don't die easy, but they do die. That evening, as twilight bled orange into the Spanish moss, something stirred in the water, something massive, silent. John stood by the bank staring into the murk. The surface broke with a slow, graceful roll. Two amber eyes watched him from beneath. He nodded, barely perceptible. Years ago he'd found it barely longer than his arm, orphaned and covered in blood. It had hissed, but he hadn't flinched. Now it returned, not tame, not loyal, but bound. John didn't name it. Names are for things you own. This one belonged to the bayou, and now it was awake again. By morning the first body had been found, face frozen in horror, rifle still clutched, half his torso missing. The others argued about gators, panthers, even poachers, but John knew better. The bayou didn't like strangers, and when it didn't like you, it sent something worse than death. It sent something patient. Clem Torres hadn't believed in monsters, not since his daddy took a shotgun to the boogeyman of his nightmares. He was the muscle of the crew, a neck like an oil drum, and a temper hotter than diesel flame. When the first body turned up half-eaten and staring at nothing, Clem spat in the water and called it gator work. "This ain't no haunted swamp," he growled, cocking his rifle, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The others listened. Barely. 4 men remained. not counting the guide who'd already vanished in the night without his boots or his pride. They pressed deeper into the wet jungle, rifles raised, crates secured, and fear riding just behind their bravado. But that night, Clem stayed awake. Something kept circling the camp. No sound, no rustle, just a pressure, like the air was folding in around them. On the second night it came closer. Clem had dozed, the butt of his gun beneath his chin, when the silence woke him. Not a frog, not a chirp, not even the buzz of skeeters. He reached for his weapon, but it was already there. Something massive, parting the reeds behind him like a slow exhale. Clem turned just as a wet scaled shadow surged from the black, a blur of ridged muscle and ancient fury. He fired once, and again, and then he was in the water, cold, blind, drowning in soundless rage. Something scraped across his thigh, razor claws, a tail. He didn't know, but then it was gone. He crawled back to shore, bleeding and shaking, alone and without his gun. By dawn, the others found him curled in the mud, muttering nonsense about eyes like gold coins and something older than war watching them. One man laughed, another said Clem had heat stroke, but they were quieter now. The jungle was too loud with its silence. John, meanwhile, had been watching from a perch no map dared mark. Deep in the maze of vines and shadows, he saw the wake that never broke surface. He saw the smoke from their campfire, and smelled the scent of copper in the air. And he saw something else, hoof prints, not gator, not deer, hoofs, heavy ones. Something was in the bayou that shouldn't be. He followed them, the path winding through patches of dry land like islands in a sea of decay, until he reached the old shed he'd boarded up long ago. It had once been a corral, back when he tried to live like people again, before he stopped pretending. Inside, buried under canvas and memories, was a saddle, not his, leather-worn and crusted, but familiar, too familiar. He hadn't seen that saddle in 40 years, not since the night he watched his best friend, a midnight black stallion named Gideon, drown in the storm that nearly took John with it. But now the prints led straight to that shack, deep, fresh. John didn't believe in ghosts, but the bayou did. The prints weren't muddied by rain or time. They were crisp, sharp, as if pressed down just moments before John arrived. He crouched beside them, fingers brushing the edge of one, wide as a dinner plate, sunken deep in the swamp's half-solid ground. A stallion's weight, maybe more. The path wove between cypress trunks and underhanging moss, following a rhythm, purposeful yet wild, and John followed it without thought. It wasn't just curiosity guiding his steps. It was something colder, something that tickled behind the eyes and made his breath hitch like he'd seen a ghost. Gideon had died in the flood. He'd been there. The river had snapped its banks like a whip, and John, too injured to walk, could only scream as the horse fought the current, until both vanished beneath the roiling brown. He never found the body. He never forgave the storm. Now the saddle had returned, and so had the prints. They led to what had once been a logging road, now eaten by the swamp. There, standing beneath the skeleton of an old wooden frame, was a shape, massive, unmoving. It looked like a horse, but darker, almost shimmering, as if made of night itself. John froze mid-step. The creature turned its head. Its eyes caught the last light of dusk, and they weren't brown, weren't black. They were red, not glowing, reflecting, like blood under glass. And then it vanished between the trees in one fluid motion, leaving behind only the scent of wet fur and earth. John didn't chase. He stood there for what felt like hours, until the frogs dared croak again. He was shaking. Meanwhile, back at the militia's makeshift camp, Clem was dying. The infection from his leg had spread, angry and red. His fever spiked and he began whispering names no one recognized, Ramon, Lieutenant Case, and Gideon, over and over. The others argued about what to do, paranoia growing like mold. Then one of them vanished while taking a piss. No splash, no scream, just gone. That broke them. The youngest, a guy they called Banks, cracked and took off into the swamp, ignoring shouted threats. He ran for hours, branches slashing his face, until he stumbled into a clearing and found the horse. It stood still, staring at him, steam rising off its coat. Its hooves were caked with moss and something darker. Banks approached slowly, whispering nonsense, trembling like a child. Then he saw what was stitched into its bridle. Military tags, rusted and old. One tag read, Duvall Johnny, HGT, blood type O+. The horse exhaled. Banks turned to run, but the bayou shifted, and from the water something massive rose. Back at his shack, John sat at the edge of his porch, shotgun laid across his lap. He didn't sleep, not anymore. The land was remembering things it shouldn't, and it was dragging them back with teeth. The crocodile hadn't returned since the last kill, but he knew it wasn't far, and now something else moved in tandem with it. The bayou wasn't just awake, it was listening. John hadn't performed the rites since the war, not since the jungle bled into his bones and taught him that not all battles were fought with bullets. He dragged the heavy crate out from beneath the shack, its corners chewed by time and rot, and pried it open with a crowbar that groaned like an old man. Inside lay remnants of a different life, coils of rusted tripwire, a bone-handled kukri, and a thick leather-bound field manual marked tactical counter-warfare, unorthodox terrain response. But beneath that, wrapped in oilskin, was something far older, not government-issued, a wooden idol, carved with symbols not even the war's darkest corners could claim. He'd taken it from a shaman in Dukrong Valley, who died smiling after his entire squad vanished without a trace, save for their boots. John stared at it, then pulled out the old map he'd drawn by hand, a crude spider web of bayou paths, dead zones, and hollow trees marked with an X. He'd never expected to use it again, but tonight wasn't about survival. It was about closing the door he never should have opened. The traps came first, tripwires tied between cypress knees, baited with raw meat and laced with his own sweat, just like he'd been taught. Deadfalls crafted from fallen branches and counterweighted with gator skulls, smoke pots packed with moss and chili powder to blind. He scattered them through the swamp like a madman painting with fire. He needed the militia scared. He needed them loud, because the thing hunting them wasn't going to stop unless John made it. But deep inside he feared it already wouldn't matter. Hours before dawn, the crocodile returned, not to him but to the place where he'd last seen Banks' bloody boot print. It glided beneath the water like a forgotten god, circling, listening. Then it sank as if waiting for something else to strike first. Across the swamp the horse appeared again, this time in the militia's clearing. Its coat shimmered like wet ash. The remaining two men stared, guns raised. One fired and the bullet ricocheted with a metallic screech. The other screamed as the ground gave way beneath him, vines pulling tight around his chest, yanking him down. The horse didn't move, it only watched. Then it turned and walked back into the mist, leaving hoofprints that steamed. And finally someone came to John, a man bearded, bleeding from the shoulder, gun lowered. Not militia, this one was younger, a local maybe. "You're him," he said. "The one who trained killers, the one who survived Vietnam. They're all dead out there, and it's not just you doing it." His eyes darted to the tree line. "I saw something, horse-shaped but wrong, eyes like fire." John didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead he held up the idol and whispered a name he hadn't spoken in over 50 years. "Gideon." The air shifted, the trees moaned, and from the water something rose. The man stood there, panting, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on his shoulder. Moonlight filtered down between the trees in silver slants, and the swamp pulsed around them, breathing through moss and still water. John eyed him, the idol tight in his hand. "You were in the bush," he said quietly, voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. "Da Krong, 71, you're not just some lost kid." The man's face twitched. "Sergeant Duvall, you saved my father," he said, voice trembling. "Private Ellis, he told me stories about a stallion that could smell snipers, about a shadow that followed you through the jungle. He said you made a pact." He looked toward the water. "He also said he watched that same stallion drown, and that afterward, you never spoke another word to anyone unless the swamp did first." John's lips curled into something close to a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your old man was a liar," he said. "It wasn't a pact, it was a curse." He tossed the idol into the mud, and it hissed like oil on iron. The trees swayed, though no wind moved. The man Ellis Jr., though he never gave his first name, stepped back, suddenly unsure. "You called it Gideon. What is it now?" John didn't answer. Instead he knelt, drew a circle into the earth with his kukri, and muttered words so old they scraped the throat like thorns. The circle glowed faintly, not with light, but with memory. Scenes flickered across the surface, war camps, blood-slick hooves, Gideon, standing guard over bodies riddled with bullets. Then the horse came. No thud of hooves, no rustle, just presence. One blink it wasn't there, and the next, it stood behind them, silent and steaming, taller than John remembered. Bones too pronounced, its coat rippled like smoke on oil. The same bridle, the same tags, but its eyes, those were new. They glowed softly, and when it looked at John, he felt a tide rise behind his ribs. "You should have let me die," John whispered, not to the man but to the beast, and it nodded. Not human, not animal, an understanding older than language. The militia was gone, one body half buried in roots, one impaled on a broken tree, still twitching. The last Clem lay curled in a hollow, mumbling to himself, surrounded by dragonflies that didn't fly away. They just watched. That night, the swamp changed. Trees leaned differently. Paths twisted back into themselves. Birds flew in circles until they dropped. The water turned dark as pitch, and something beneath it pulsed alive, aware, waiting. John sat by the fire again, kukri across his knees. Ellis Jr. sat across from him, staring wide-eyed at the creature tethered by no rope, no fence, only history. "You raised it?" he asked. "I buried it," John said. "And it came back?" "No." John looked up, the fire dancing in his weathered eyes. "It never left." The swamp was shifting, not just in the way that water shifted when wind ran through it, but deeper, like the bones of the land were realigning beneath their feet. By dawn, John and Ellis Jr. had stopped speaking. Words felt heavy now, too small for what circled them. The horse, if it could still be called that, had stood unmoving through the night, eyes fixed somewhere far off, like it was listening to voices buried in the roots. Then, just before the sun broke over the tree line, it turned. No sound, no prompting, just turned and began walking. John followed without hesitation. Ellis hesitated for just a moment longer, then shouldered his rifle and went after them. The path wasn't a path, it was a memory. Trees arched overhead like ribs, their bark peeling in strips that whispered against one another. Where there should have been solid ground, there were bones, half-sunken animal skulls, vertebrae, antlers twisted like old iron. Each step sank an inch too deep, like the land didn't want them there. The horse, Gideon, led them for miles, always just ahead, always choosing the direction with impossible certainty. Then the smell hit, salt and rot, wet leather and iron, not blood, older than blood. They reached a clearing wrapped in cypress trees bent into unnatural bows. In the center stood a lone tree, blackened and dead, its limbs gnarled into claw-like curves. Beneath it, half buried in the silt, was the old bell. John stopped cold. That bell was part of a chapel. He rasped, voice hollow. Built by the French, sank in the flood of '78. I was 10 when I found it the first time. Thought I was dreaming. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the black sludge. The bell's surface was carved with symbols, some Latin, some older. Beneath the bell was a grave. No marker, just a hollow space in the earth where something large had been laid and forgotten. But not Gideon. No bones, no traces of a body, just a bridle, rotted but familiar, and the unmistakable glint of a human dog tag. Ellis bent down, wiping away the muck. "This one says K-Simel. Captain, wasn't he the officer your father served under?" John's jaw clenched. "Case died in '71, ambushed. We never found the body." He looked up at Gideon, who stood still as a statue, nostrils flaring. "They buried him here, alongside the thing they tried to bind." Ellis stood slowly, voice tight. "This isn't just about the horse, is it?" John didn't answer, not with words, because from the far end of the clearing, the trees parted, and the crocodile emerged. Its scales were caked in something that shimmered like oil. It was bigger now, impossibly big, jaws wide, tail dragging furrows into the ground. But it didn't charge. It stopped beside Gideon, and for one breathless moment, predator and beast faced each other. Then both turned toward the tree. "What the hell is happening?" Ellis whispered. John exhaled, his voice dry as bone. "They're not mine. They never were. They're his." and the earth beneath the bell began. The crack widened, slow and deliberate, splitting the earth beneath the bell like flesh beneath a scalpel. The air thickened, metallic, sour, alive. Flies rose in a black cloud, spiraling upward, then scattering as the dead cypress groaned under a pressure no wind carried. Ellis backed up, rifle raised but useless, while Gideon and the crocodile stood sentinel, unflinching. John didn't move. His eyes had locked on the chasm forming before him, a trench bleeding steam, and within it, the glint of bone. It wasn't a body, not exactly. Bones were fused in unnatural ways, human rib cages melded with equine femurs, a spine too long, too coiled, ending in vertebrae like tusks. Tendons still clung in places, twitching in jerks as though waking from a nightmare. Wrapped around the mass was what remained of a uniform, tattered green camo eaten by rot, but still bearing the name K's. But the skull that slowly tilted upward wasn't his, it was something else. It had a snout, it had sockets too wide, and in the hollow eyes light, dim, flickering, but unmistakably red. John dropped to one knee, not in fear, but in memory. Back into Kronk, he said quietly, not to Ellis, but to the thing. We were cornered, outnumbered, wounded. Case panicked. He said he had a solution. He'd made a deal weeks before. A spirit tethered to the land, said it would give us control of the terrain, turn the jungle into our ally. All it needed was blood. His voice broke like an old branch. He used Gideon, slit the horse's throat under a full moon, buried it alive in a valley where no birds flew. But Gideon didn't die. Not really. He changed. I dug him up. I made sure. Ellis stepped forward, horrified. You brought him back. I couldn't leave him, John whispered. But the spirit, it never wanted the horse. It wanted a vessel, something loyal, something bound to me. And when Gideon rose, Case vanished. Now I know where he went. The thing under the bell shifted, rising, half horse, half man, crowned in bone, veins like roots crawling across its back. Its jaw opened, and the voice that escaped sounded like breaking trees. You broke the seal, Sergeant. Gideon stepped forward, tail flicking once like a signal. The crocodile slithered to the side, positioning itself between the mass and Ellis. You can't control this, Ellis said, eyes wide. You fed this thing for decades. No, John said. I contained it, and now the swamp's turning against the seal. The land wants it free. The wind picked up, sharp and sulphurous. The tree cracked as roots lifted from the ground, and beneath the bell the creature fully emerged. Not Case, not Gideon, but the ugly fusion of both, twisted by greed, sacrifice, and unfinished ritual. John stood. This ends tonight. Now, steaming with rot and ancient power, bones clicking in patterns like some obscene language. Its breath rattled like wind through a graveyard, and the air around it began to shimmer. Heat without fire, death without flame. Ellis raised his rifle, but John lifted a hand without looking. No bullets, he said, voice steel wrapped in silence. This thing was born in ritual. It only dies by one. The creature grinned, if it could be called that, its mouth splitting in unnatural hinges. Do you remember the price, Sergeant? The one you never paid? John stepped forward into the circle of bones, the soil pulsing beneath his boots like a heartbeat. I never paid because I bartered. I gave you the horse, and in return you kept my secrets buried. But now you've broken your end. The vessel lives, the thing hissed, and you're too old to bury it again. John reached into his shirt and pulled out a small pouch, leather worn through decades of sweat and grime. Inside a tooth, long, yellowed, unmistakably equine. This was Gideon's. Pulled it the night I found his grave empty. Carried it every day since. He dropped it into the mud. The swamp screamed. The ground erupted in a sudden surge, vines coiling around the creature's limbs like snakes. Gideon neighed. Not the sound of any living horse, but a thunderous, low-bellied roar. The crocodile launched from the reeds, snapping at the beast's legs, dragging it toward the broken bell like an executioner's assistant. But it wasn't enough. The creature tore free, a whip of bone slicing across the gator's side, sending blood and scales into the water. Gideon charged, hooves crashing into the twisted hybrid that had once been part of his blood. They collided with the force of hurricanes. Flesh and bone tore. The cypress trees shook. John stepped into the fray with the kukri held low, and began carving symbols into the dirt, each line glowing faintly as he moved. It's an old rite, he muttered. half to Ellis, half to himself. Jungle-born, Vietnamese. They called it the Gunjan Trin, the binding battle. No weapons, no fire, just you, the land, and the blood that remembers. Ellis watched in horror as the crocodile, now mortally wounded, coiled around the creature's legs one last time, anchoring it in place. Gideon reared, hooves crashing down, bones snapping beneath him, but the creature wouldn't fall, not completely. It turned its head toward Ellis. One of you must take the burden. Ellis staggered back, eyes wild. What? It needs a host, John said, his face pale. It always did. It fed on Case, wore his body for years. It will do the same to you if you let it. The creature reached, slow and almost gentle, toward Ellis. You have the blood, the name, come willingly, and the pain ends here. Gideon snarled, stepping between them, but Ellis was frozen, conflicted, tempted. John raised his knife, not at the creature but at himself. This ends with me. The swamp howled as the final lines of the ritual burned into the soil. Gideon's eyes locked with John's. No words, just memory. Then the creature lunged. The creature lunged with a sound like a landslide, wet, cracking, relentless. Bone and sinew twisted through the air. A grotesque tangle of limbs reaching for Ellis like an old debt finally come due. John didn't hesitate. He turned the kukri inward, its curved blade pressed tight against the spot just below his sternum. The swamp around him vibrated, a living drumbeat urging him forward. Gideon reared with a shriek, hooves slicing the air, and the crocodile let out one final death rattle before collapsing entirely into the water. Eyes open but unseeing, the blade sank deep. John didn't cry out. He didn't fall. He remained standing, blood blooming across his chest like a dark flower. The earth trembled beneath him, and the ritual circle ignited in a burst of phosphorescent green. A wind tore through the clearing, not of air but memory. Decades of violence, grief, sacrifice and silence peeling away like old bark. The creature shrieked and recoiled, flailing like it had touched fire. It wasn't supposed to be you, it roared. You were the binder, not the offering. John's mouth curved in a bitter smile. I've always been both. The blood soaked into the dirt, mingling with the symbols he'd carved. His final command to the land. The circle flared, becoming a glowing snare that wrapped around the creature's twisted form. It writhed, bone joints snapping in protest, limbs fighting the pull of a force older than curses. Gideon lunged forward, grabbing the beast by its exposed spine and dragging it into the heart of the ritual. You don't get another host, John whispered. You get a coffin. Ellis ran to him, catching John as he staggered. The old soldier's legs gave, knees hitting the mud with a weight that seemed to echo. You can't die here, Ellis said, voice breaking. You can't leave it like this. John smiled faintly. Son, this is the only place I can die. The creature screamed once more, a keening, unnatural howl that shook birds from the trees and sent ripples across every still pool in the swamp. Then, with a blinding flash of pale green light, it collapsed inward, not vanished. Bound, the bones cracked and folded into themselves, the flesh turning to vapor, the earth swallowing the remnants until there was only the bell, and then even that sank. Silence fell. The swamp exhaled. Gideon stood over John, his breathing ragged black coat now streaked with mud and something darker. He knelt, lowering his massive head to John's chest, nostrils flaring. Remembering. You're free now, John whispered. No